Can you hear me in the back okay? First of all, Ray, thank you very much for that introduction. It's always flattering to hear nice things about yourself, but especially when your mother is in the room. So that's kind of nice. Secondly, I'd like to say thank you to everybody in this room and for your service. It is humbling for me to be here when I think about the collective years of service that you have provided to our nation. So thank you very much. And then finally, I'd like to say thank you to my family for being here. My mom and dad, obviously. I wouldn't be here today in a literal and a philosophical sense if not for them and the way they raised myself, my brother, my sister, Tom, his wife Karen, Marisa, her husband Steve. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you guys. As Ray said, I was a soldier for 23 years. So the remarks I will say tonight are not only my opinion, please understand that, they're my opinion, but they're also the perspective of a soldier. And so when I say soldier or soldiering, that's my perspective, but it's also an attempt to talk about the military in general. So I don't mean to slight any airmen, my father, any sailors or any Marines out there when I say soldier. Ray asked me to talk tonight about current trends in the military today. And I believe that any discussion about the military today would encompass three things. The first, a discussion about the world environment that we find ourselves in. The second would be the mission that we ask our soldiers, our military to do. And the third thing would be to talk about that force, the men and women who today wear the uniform of our armed forces. You can look at the news, you can read the newspaper. It's not very difficult to see that we live in a very dangerous and a very ambiguous world. It's the environment that the military finds itself in today is a global environment. Our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine can be asked, and they are asked, to serve across the globe. That's a hard task because when we think of the military, we think of a force in readiness, preparing to do something. But when we might ask them to go anywhere in the world, it's hard to prepare and train for something like that. So that environment, the fact that it's global, is a very difficult thing. The environment is also increasingly an urban environment. Cities are a very difficult place to fight, and they're a really difficult place to fight if you don't want civilian casualties. And so this is something that we see every time the Israeli military has to go into the Gaza Strip and the efforts they take, the fighting in Afghanistan, the fighting in Iraq. It's an important aspect of the environment, and the things we ask the military to do are in this context, a very difficult thing. The threats that are out there, they're governments and they're non-governments. This organization that has taken over much of Syria and Iraq, the Islamic State, they're not a traditional government as we would recognize it, but they are a threat. And the military has to be able to deal with all kinds of threats. These threats are conventional threats. The Russians entering the Ukraine with tanks, as we might have expected a war to be fought for the last 100 years. But they are also unconventional or asymmetric threats. That's a word you hear a lot. It's asymmetric threats. What does that mean? That means that they will do things that we really can't respond to, or that we really can't respond to well. And they force us to, as a military, come up with new ideas and to be innovative. And then finally, the last thing I'll say about the environment that you probably won't hear from any politician, certainly, is that this is a long war. Especially with regards to this threat that's in Iraq and Syria. The fundamental Islamic jihad threat. Martin Dempsey the other day talked about our presence in Iraq. This will be a long time to defeat ISIS. What he didn't tell you was a long time means 30 or 50 years. It might be 100 years. And so this is something that our military has to be prepared for, that we have to be prepared for as a nation, that we are in a long war. That leads me to a discussion quickly of the mission. What do we ask our military to do? We'll ask our military to do everything and anything that nobody else can do. Whether it's handing out meals and handing out blankets to some place where a flood or a hurricane or an earthquake has just created massive devastation. It might mean dealing with a conventional force, the Navy in the Pacific guarding against the Chinese moving into places that other allies might not want them to be in. And it means a counterterrorism force that our special operations have become so good at, to find and discover and hunt down the people who do things like the attacks on 9/11. So there's this broad spectrum of missions that absolutely no one else has been able to do as well as our military does. And we should all be thankful for the fact that they train so well and so hard to do all these myriad things. And that leads me to the final thing, which is a discussion of the military force today. William Shakespeare, as far as I know, was never spent a day in uniform, but he wrote in his play Henry V these words that he gave to King Henry on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, vastly outnumbered by the French. Henry V says, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today who sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." And that is the spirit of the military. It's always been the spirit of the military. You all know it. The fact that we do things as much or more so for the men and women serving with us as we do for flag and country is something that is fundamental to being a soldier. Our force is the most professional it's ever been. It's completely of volunteers, people who serve because they are called to serve. Technologically, this is the most advanced military that anyone has ever seen. 13 years ago, when we first went to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, anyone who served in World War II probably could have come into my battalion and done very well as a soldier. John Wayne, when he commanded my battalion, actually, John Wayne didn't command my battalion. John Wayne played Ben Vandervoot in the movie The Longest Day, which was the battalion that I had the good fortune of commanding many years later. But, and I would have liked to have had John Wayne in my battalion, there's no doubt about it. But John Wayne and Ben Vandervoot would have done very well in the 2nd Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment in the early days of 2001, 2003, because we were fighting essentially with the same kinds of tools. That's not the case today. Today, the vast array of unmanned systems that fly, the robotics, the means we have to communicate across the battlefield, it's an amazing thing to watch and to see, and the way that we are able to maintain a persistent surveillance and a persistent understanding of the threats and the enemy that's out there, unparalleled in history, unparalleled by any other force that's out there right now, today. That's not to say that we will be able to maintain that advantage forever if we're not vigilant. The soldiers and military that we have in Army Day, they're very adaptive and they're very resilient. This environment that's global, that's urban, the threats that are government and non-government, that takes a certain amount of adaptability. You can't be rigid in your thinking. You can't be fixed in your mind on how you do things. You have to be very open to change and very open to learning. And that's what we've developed in our military, certainly over the last 30, 40 years in particular. In our national training centers, the way we train is by giving ourselves a very hard task. No other military that I know of in the world would put themselves through the kinds of training where you consistently fail like we do. Because in failing or coming close to failure in training is we understand the place where you learn and where you grow. And that has saved many lives in combat over these last 13 years. So let me finish by humanizing it a little bit for you and talking to you about a few of the men who are in my band of brothers. The first one I want to talk to you about is Sergeant First Class Dan Metzger. Dan was a squad leader for me when I was a battalion commander, and he was in Bravo Company, and that's kind of far removed from where you are as a battalion commander. And I've got he had a company commander and a first sergeant, and a platoon leader and a platoon sergeant between me and him. But I knew him, he stood out because he was this energetic and life-loving guy. He loved his men, and he trained them hard. But sometimes he was one of those guys that you kind of had to reel him in a little bit, which I love because I much prefer to pull somebody back and to kick them in the butt to get them going. We left Afghanistan in the summer of 2003, but in the winter of 2004, after I had left 2nd Battalion, 505th, the battalion was sent into Iraq to help secure the election sites for the first election that was going to happen there. And in January of that year, while on patrol, Dan and some of the other men with him noticed something that didn't seem quite right in a garbage pile on the side of the road. So they got other vehicles, and as they moved up to see what this was, it exploded. The blast from the artillery shell killed two soldiers outright and wounded 2 others, one of which was Dan. He ended up having his right leg amputated above the knee. And I think about that and I go, wow, most people, a lot of people I know would probably just quit at that point. But not Dan. Dan petitioned to stay on active duty, which he did. He was a staff sergeant at the time. He was such an indomitable spirit that he became this recruiter, not initially within the brigade that we were a part of, but then for the Army at large. He became the first amputee to be a member of the Golden Knights sport parachute team. That's the Army's version of the Blue Angels or the Thunderbirds. He seemed to excel and just bring this whole spirit to everybody around him. In fact, he would come to our house every year at Halloween, which is a big holiday for us in our house there in Fayetteville. And we call it trick or beer because we hand candy out to the kids, but I brew beer and I give beer to the adults that come by. And Dan would be there to help us hand out candy, but he would always wear shorts. So his leg, his sea leg, was exposed. And little kids are great because they'll come up and they're not afraid, and they would ask him, "Wow, is that real?" And he would reply without missing a beat. He'd say, "No, that's my costume. I'm a transformer." And so you're around a guy like that and you go, "Wow, this is just the greatest thing." But you learn quickly, soon enough, that not all the wounds are visible. 3 o'clock in the morning in January of 2009, I was awakened by a phone call, and it was Dan. And he had obviously been thinking about it a lot, and he'd been drinking, and he was asking the question, why? Why was all this, and how much more would he have to give? I told him he didn't have to give anything more. He'd given all that anybody would ever ask him to give. His service, the way he continued to serve. And we talked for about an hour, and it dawned on me at that point something I should have seen early on, and that was that, the scars, they're not just the physical scars. And he's battled with some issues with, substance and painkillers, but he's come out of that, and he is now retired as a sergeant first class, living in Arizona, and he's an entrepreneur that you would anybody who's a businessman would be inspired by this guy. He's working 3 or 4 different things right now, and every day there's something new, and he'll call me up and, "Hey, I got a great idea." So that's one of the kinds of soldiers that you can be proud of who's out there. One of my band of brothers. Another is Major Rob Shaw. Rob was the first captain of his class at West Point. That's the senior cadet, graduated in the year 2000. He was a lieutenant and then a captain in our battalion. and by far the best lieutenant in the organization. And because of that, I made him our support platoon leader. That's the guy in charge of the platoon. In an airborne battalion, after you jump out of the airplane, you're walking. Except that we had a platoon of trucks. We counted on that platoon of trucks to move people, to move ammunition, to move food. And if the trucks didn't show up at the right time and place, people went hungry, or they didn't have bullets, or they stayed on the drop zone all night long. So you needed good people in that platoon. So I pulled Rob aside after a training exercise. I said, Rob, I'm going to make you the support platoon leader. And he didn't want to do it. He wanted to be the reconnaissance platoon leader. You know, that was the guys out there crawling through the grass trying to find the enemy with a knife in their teeth. You know? And I'm like, I can train anybody to be the scout platoon leader, but I need a really good leader to be the support platoon leader. A couple of months later, he came back to me and he said, sir, thank you so much. This has been the greatest assignment. And he excelled at it. Rob's now a major. He served with the Rangers. But when he was a captain, commanding a company in Iraq, he was on a combat mission in his Stryker combat vehicle. And an Iraqi insurgent, driving a vehicle that was full of liquefied explosive material, rammed into his vehicle and detonated. And the flames that came up over his vehicle killed his interpreter outright and burned most of the people in his vehicle to the point where they had to be medevaced to the burn center in San Antonio. His first sergeant held on for a few days, but passed after 3 or 4 days from being medevaced. Rob had a broken leg, but he wasn't as badly burned because of his position in the vehicle, and he was sent back to Fort Lewis. But in recovering, he couldn't go back to take command of his company, but he could go back, and he did. He went back to be a staff officer in his battalion because he didn't want to leave his men behind. When the battalion came out of Iraq, he was allowed to take command of that company again and serve through. But he went to the Rangers and he was doing great things. He's been in and out of Iraq and Afghanistan. But 3 years ago, he found himself fighting another enemy, a new threat. He was having issues with his immune system and having issues with his stamina. And finally, the doctors figured out that he had a very rare blood cancer, something not normally found in men his age. In fact, found normally in men twice his age. And the really unusual thing was that in one of his platoons from his company fighting in Iraq, 17 of the 31 men in that platoon had come down with weird and unusual and unique forms of cancer. Talking to Rob about it, he thinks that it goes back to a firefight they had in a warehouse. He said there were barrels of some sort of chemical in there that as they were having this firefight with these insurgents, the barrels were getting shot up and the chemicals were spilling out. And so 17 of these 31 men in this platoon have come down with cancers that there's no other explanation as to how it happened. Some have succumbed to the cancer. The man who took over as first sergeant after his first sergeant had died passed away last year. And Rob continues to fight and serve. He continues to serve, and he's got it under control. And the hope is that, you know, if he beats it through these next 5 years, he'll make it 50. But it never entered his mind, I don't think, to leave the service as long as he could. And so he serves. And finally, the last guy I want to tell you about, this guy's amazing. Master Sergeant Chuck Ritter. Now, I never served with Chuck when I was on active duty, but a year and a half ago when I was in Afghanistan, 2013, I was serving at a small camp called Camp Moorhead. And there was a Special Forces A-team working there. And Chuck was the team sergeant of this A-team, 3331. And he knew that I'd like to run and do things, and he challenged me to a duel. But he wasn't him. It was his youngest Green Beret was going to challenge me to a race up this mountain that we had. And I looked at him and I said, Chuck, you know, I'll race the guy, no problem. But you realize I'm 53 years old. If I even come close to beating him, I win. What is that? And the rest of your team is in bad shape if he's your best guy. So never heard another word about the challenge after that. But Chuck and I came to know each other and become friends. But about a week before I came home in June of 2013, Chuck was on a mission with his team and with a company of Afghan commandos. And they were in a place called Tagab, which has become a very dangerous place in Afghanistan. You can't go there without getting into a firefight these days. And everybody knew that, but of course Chuck and his team went. And to hear Chuck talk about it, it was the worst firefight he'd ever been in Afghanistan. It reminded him more of the kinds of fights and battles he'd been in Iraq during the surge years of 06 and 07 when things were so bad. Grenades were coming over the wall of this compound they were in, and the enemy had set up a machine gun down this road, and one of the Afghan commandos had gotten pinned down outside the wall and was wounded. And none of the Afghans would go get him, so Chuck decided he needed to go get him. And he did. And he pulled the guy in, but not without getting shot first in the back. The bullet came in between his body armor, came in through his left shoulder and lodged below his right shoulder. Badly wounded, but survivable. His third Purple Heart. Now, Chuck was redeployed. I was lucky enough to see him in the hospital at Bagram before we both went home, under different circumstances, obviously. And I saw him as he was awarded this third Purple Heart. And the general that pinned it on his pillow next to him said, that's the last one, no more. Chuck was like, Roger, yes sir. Well, Chuck went back to Afghanistan in October. Martha and I ran into him in Southern Pines, North Carolina, and over the summer. He was talking about how he was ready to go back and the training they'd done, the mission was changing, but he was going to deal with it. Thursday night, Martha and I are walking to a restaurant with a friend in Durham, North Carolina, and I looked at my phone and there's a text message there from Chuck with a picture of a soldier in combat gear talking on the radio, his right hand bandaged, and obviously blood there. And the text said, 2 machine gun rounds to the hand. And I'm looking at the picture, I'm thinking, man, is that Chuck? So I texted back to him, I said, is that you? And the reply came back, yep. I'm like, where the hell are you? What are you doing? He says, I'm in Germany getting my hand reconstructed. His 4th Purple Heart. I said, man, you need to get home. He said, I'm on my way home, but I'll be back here by the end of December. Why? Because that's where his men are, right? So these are the men you have serving for us. They're great. They're absolutely amazing. So the bottom line of all this for me, what can I tell you to walk away with this Veterans Day week to understand? There's a dangerous world out there, you all know that. The mission for our military is incredibly difficult because it's so ambiguous and so wide-ranging. But the men and women who serve today are as good as we've ever had. They're unbeatable, but they're not unbreakable. So what do we owe them? We owe them to make sure that our leadership in the government develops a national strategy. We're lacking. We don't have a national strategy, in my opinion. And you can't have a military strategy without having a national strategy. So, if there's anything we can do for those men and women who serve today, it's to tell your congressman, your senator, hey, come up with a plan. Be realistic. Tell it to us straight. If we're going to be fighting these guys for 30 years, for 50 years, we want to hear it. We want to know what we plan to do about it. And then let's resource these men and women the way they need to be resourced to fight and win. The 82nd Airborne Division, which I proudly served with for a number of years, has a motto that they've recently adapted to describe the way they view the world and their role in it. Their current motto is, jump, fight, win tonight. I'm watching the Notre Dame game today with my dad. It reminds me of the big sign they've got there, play like a champion today. And so I think that's what we see in the best of our soldiers. What we owe them is the best of our support. I thank you for your service and for your time tonight. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions of Mike?
That's good. Thank you.
I have one.
Okay.
I know this is far removed from what you do, but I heard a discussion today among a couple of civilians that they're very upset that the Navy SEALs sort of spilled their guts here in the past couple of weeks. Two guys are claiming both to have shot bin Laden and all this kind of stuff. And their thoughts were, they're sworn to secrecy. Why are they doing that? And that's the question.
Sure. I can't speak for why they're speaking. I can tell you from my experience working with both the SEALs and Delta Force, they're the finest we have out there. But sometimes, on both, sometimes people talk. They write books, they appear in movies, they appear on TV. And I think sometimes they're motivated by money and sometimes they're motivated by recognition. But I know in the case of the Delta Force, when someone does that, they become instantly uninvited to the organization. They can never come back for organization formals or reunions. And that's a hell of a price to pay for having spoken out. You spend your life and many years training to be a part of the most elite organization in the world. So I don't know why they would speak out. I don't believe they should have spoken out. I believe it's quite possible in an enclosed space in the dark that they both did in fact shoot bin Laden and not realize who did or didn't, because that's just kind of the nature of the fight. But and I haven't watched yet the interview that he gave on Fox over 2 nights, Tuesday and Wednesday. But I'm saddened by the fact that he did that, and that he makes himself an even bigger target than he already was, just by the fact that it's discoverable that he was a Navy SEAL. It's probably discoverable that he worked for SEAL Team 6. And to be honest, I'm surprised that we haven't seen more instances of terrorists attacking our elite commandos and their families at Fort Bragg or in Virginia Beach, in different places. I'm really surprised we haven't seen it. They've called for it. This current group, ISIS, has called for that to happen. We saw in Canada last month something that looked kind of like that. So I think it's given all that, it's confusing to me why he would speak out the way he did. So,
Thank you.
thank you. Yes.
Mike, how do the rules of engagement affecting the fight with people? How does it evolve? Is it something that's strictly a military decision, or is that coming from someplace else?
The military obviously makes recommendation, but it comes from the administration through the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And you can believe that there are plenty of lawyers involved as well when the rules of engagement are established. They're pretty simple and straightforward in combat, and there's only one rule of engagement for armed forces, and that's pretty standard. It says if you any hostile act or hostile intention can be met with deadly force. So if someone coming at you with a weapon, or somebody with a weapon who you think is intending to use it to harm friendly forces or do some damage, can be dealt with hostile or deadly force. The problem becomes when we have commanders who try to interpret that for various and different reasons and place other caveats on their soldiers. The current rules of engagement have been drastically affected by the mission set. We no longer in Afghanistan, after the end of this year, will have anybody who is officially doing combat operations outside of the special operations forces who were there doing counterterrorism operations against Al-Qaeda and other various designated targets, people who are known to be hostile to the government, so they're on the list for capture or kill. Everybody else who's over there is in a mission to train, advise, and assist the Afghans. So their rules of engagement are the same. They can use deadly force if they see hostile act or hostile intent. But the missions that they're on don't lend themselves to that. And so there's more pressure on them not to be in the fight or not to shoot first, to wait. And that's a very difficult thing for a young soldier out there to understand. It becomes more complicated. One of the things we see, so for every soldier who's out there right now, there's pretty much at least one or two contractors. This is something that we don't talk about a whole lot. And as a contractor, I can tell you I take particular interest in how the rules of engagement affect the contractor if you're in the combat zone. Contractors are not allowed to use deadly force for hostile intent. They are only allowed to use deadly force in self-defense. Now again, it's a judgment call, but under most rules, it's not an issue. However, under the current agreement that was just signed, contractors in Afghanistan are not allowed to use deadly force of any kind. In fact, there probably will not be contractors who are armed. And yet the State Department relies heavily on armed contractors. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But the rules of engagement are fairly straightforward as written. The problem becomes that as the mission changes, it becomes a gray area and complicated for soldiers to, I think, understand. Did that answer your question, or did I? There is involvement from the political side, but it's pretty well developed and enforced by the military side. Thank you.
Thank you.